At 6:30 on March 1st, 1943, the rain-soaked coral runway at Port Moresby glistened under the dim gray light of dawn. The kind of morning where the air tasted like metal and the horizon felt impossibly far away. Major Ed Larner stood motionless beside his B-25 Mitchell, boots sinking slightly into the wet grit, eyes fixed on the crews preparing their aircraft for a mission that senior command had already labeled suicidal. 31 years old, hardened by 72 combat missions and carrying the weight of 0 ships sunk, Larner stared into a storm he knew he could not avoid. Across the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese had launched a convoy unlike anything 5th Air Force had seen in months, 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers, leaving Rabaul under cover of night, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers to reinforce the garrison at Leh. American intelligence intercepted the transmission before dawn. Every transport that reached Leh meant thousands of fresh troops the Allies would eventually have to face, kill, or die trying to stop. In the unforgiving jungles of New Guinea, every reinforcement extended the war by months, perhaps years. The problem confronting Larner was simple, cruel, and mathematical. High-altitude bombing didn't work. From 10,000 feet, a 1,000-pound bomb took 37 seconds to fall. In those 37 seconds, a Japanese destroyer traveling at 30 knots moved over 380 yards, more than 3 football fields. American bombardiers aimed at where ships were. Bombs hit only where ships had once been. The hit rate after 8 months of attempts, a humiliating 3%. Beautifully framed bombing photos returned to base. Tight, perfect patterns exploding harmlessly in empty water, while the convoy sailed on untouched. And the cost was growing unbearable. Japanese anti-aircraft crews were masters of timing. They tracked high-altitude bombers with calm, mathematical precision, placing flak where the formations would be by the time shells reached altitude. Too often, by the time the bombers released their payload, half the formation was burning. Larner's own squadron had lost 4 aircraft in a single month, more than 40 men, all killed trying to do the impossible. General George Kenney, commander of 5th Air Force, had proposed something so radical that pilots laughed when they first heard it, not because it was funny, but because it sounded insane. Skip bombing. Fly at 50 feet. Release the bomb 300 yards out, let it skip across the water like a flat stone, and slam into the hull. Theory said it would work, but pilots, including Larner, had a different name for it: suicide. 50 feet meant they'd be flying straight into the concentrated fire of destroyers armed with everything from heavy 127mm guns to swarms of 25mm cannons. One hit to an engine at that altitude would tear the B-25 into pieces before anyone could even react. Command had banned the tactic twice. Too dangerous, too unproven, too likely to end with entire crews dying for nothing. Larner had requested practice in December. Denied. Requested again in January. Denied. The official response: reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. But high-altitude tactics weren't sinking ships. They weren't even scratching them. Still, something had shifted. Kenney's mechanics had ripped out the bombardier's position in the nose of the B-25 and installed 8 forward-facing .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in the nose, 4 mounted in blisters along the fuselage. 1,000 pounds of additional weight, a new center of gravity, a transformation from medium bomber to something closer to a maritime strike fighter that could spit 200 rounds per second. The plan was simple: spray so much fire during the approach that Japanese gunners would either duck or die, forcing them to choose between firing back or surviving the next second. For 3 quiet weeks, Larner had watched mechanics bolt those guns into place, shaping something the world had never seen before. A bomber meant to charge directly into the jaws of a convoy and survive. But none of that mattered unless someone proved skip bombing worked in combat. And today, like it or not, that someone was him. At 7 o'clock, Larner stepped into the operations tent, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the planning maps. The convoy had been spotted at dawn, 8 massive transports in 2 tight columns, destroyers forming a deadly perimeter. Every ship was loaded with troops, ammunition, and heavy equipment. If they reached Lae, New Guinea would become a graveyard of Allied hopes. He had 3 hours. 3 hours to teach his men to fly in a way no bomber crew was ever trained to fly. 3 hours to prepare 9 B-25s for a tactic that had been outlawed less than a month ago. 3 hours to decide if he believed Kenny or believed the fear clawing at his gut. When his squadron leaders arrived, he looked each man in the eye and laid out the plan they weren't supposed to know existed. No altitude, no margin for error, no second passes. 1 run, 1 bomb, 1 chance. The room was silent. Every man understood exactly what was being asked of him, and every man nodded. At 7:45, engines roared to life across the rain-soaked runway. Lerner climbed into his seat, rain hitting the screenplay like small hard stones. As the Mitchell surged forward, he felt the familiar mix of dread and duty tightening inside his chest. In 90 minutes, he would either rewrite the rules of aerial warfare or lead his entire squadron to their deaths.
The 9 B-25 Mitchells lifted off the soaked runway at Port Moresby like blunt, steel-skinned predators rising out of a gray sea, their engines roaring in unison as they clawed for altitude. Major Ed Larner sat rigid in his cockpit, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the horizon where the clouds sagged low and heavy like bruised curtains hiding the danger ahead. Below him lay a deadly chain of coral reefs, mangrove swamps, and hostile jungle that stretched all the way to Lae. Ahead of him lay the Bismarck Sea, and the largest Japanese convoy New Guinea had seen since the start of the war. Every man in the air that morning knew what they were flying into. The 8 transports and 8 destroyers were not just ships, they were floating fortresses, each one armed with layers of anti-aircraft guns that could turn the sky into a wall of fire. And yet, for all that firepower, Larner's true enemy sat quietly inside the bomb bays of his own aircraft, 5 500-pound bombs that were only deadly if they hit something. And American high-altitude bombing had never hit anything that mattered. Skip bombing was no longer a theory or a training video. In less than an hour, it would be the only tactic standing between victory and disaster. The low-altitude approach meant the B-25s would skim the ocean's surface at 50 to 100 feet, flying so low the propellers would kick up sprays of seawater, flying so close the Japanese gunners could see the fear in their eyes. It was insane. It was suicidal, but it was the only chance they had. Larner looked over his shoulder at the 4 blister-mounted 5-caliber machine guns that mechanics had bolted on in the dead of night. They weren't standard, they weren't approved, they weren't even balanced properly. But they turned the nose of the Mitchell into a battering ram of lead, 8 guns firing forward, 4 guns firing from the waist, 2 in the top turret and 1 in the belly. If the B-25 had once been a bomber, now it was something else entirely. A storm of fire wrapped in aluminum. The first Japanese reconnaissance float plane spotted them at 09:15. A small silver glint against the clouds, then the radio crackle. Bogey sighted! Sending signal. Larner cursed under his breath. Surprise was gone. Minutes later, a cluster of black dots appeared on the horizon, Zeros scrambling from Lae, racing toward them, slicing through the air with lethal elegance. Larner didn't hesitate. Gunners, ready. Keep it tight." The formation shifted. The B-25s closed in, wings almost overlapping, forming a moving fortress of machine gun fire. When the Zeros dove in, they met a wall of 5-caliber rounds so thick it carved glowing lines through the sky. 3 Zeros went down in the first attack, torn apart before their guns even fired. But more came. 1 Zero dove straight at Larner's aircraft, guns flashing, bullets rattling against the fuselage like angry hail. Larner pulled hard, skimming the waves, the B-25's belly nearly touching the sea. The Zero overshot, pulling up too late, smashing into the water in an explosion of spray and flame. The fight ended as suddenly as it began. The remaining Japanese fighters peeled off, short on fuel, leaving the B-25s battered but intact, and directly in the path of the convoy. At 0947, Larner saw it, first as a gray blur, then as shapes. Then unmistakably, the long, unwavering columns of ships plowing through the Bismarck Sea, their decks crowded with soldiers, their destroyers slicing the ocean like predators escorting prey. "All aircraft," Larner said, his voice steady though his heartbeat hammered against his ribs, "prepare for attack run." The plan was brutally simple. Phase 1, strafe the ships. Phase 2, skip the bombs. Phase 3, get the hell out before the sky turned molten. But simplicity ends the moment metal meets fire. As the B-25s dropped to 50 feet, the Japanese destroyers erupted. Anti-aircraft guns burst into action, spewing fountains of tracers, red, white, green, turning the air into a cage of molten steel. The sea around the bombers exploded in violent geysers. One ship's gunners fired so furiously their barrels glowed red. Larner's aircraft shook violently, vibrations rattling his bones, his vision blurring as flak bursts painted black flowers across the sky. But the forward guns were already roaring. A river of 5-caliber fire streamed from the nose of his B-25, ripping through Japanese gunners, tearing down masts, shattering open cargo doors, setting decks ablaze. The destroyers were stunned, their tracking systems useless against aircraft flying lower than their elevation settings allowed. Larner pushed the throttle to maximum. The Mitchell sprinted toward a transport so close he could see the startled faces of soldiers on deck. Bomb bay open. The bomb doors yawned wide. His bombardier had no bomb sight, just instinct and timing. 300 yards, 200, hold, drop. 5 bombs hit the water, skipped once, twice, then slammed into the ship's hull in a blinding eruption of steel, fire, and water. The transport lurched violently. Flames erupted from its bow. Men leaped into the sea. Larner pulled up sharply, engine screaming under the strain. Behind him, another B-25 lined up for its run, then another. The sky had become a battlefield of fire and courage, with bombers diving so low their wheels nearly kissed the waves. For the first time in the Pacific War, skip bombing was no longer a theory or a training video. It was devastation made real.
The first ship burned like a floating torch, black smoke curling into the pale morning sky as Larner's B-25 roared away from the blast wave, the engines screaming from the sudden climb. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the transport listing hard to port, flames eating through its decks, soldiers scrambling in blind panic as ammunition stores ignited one after another. But there was no time to watch it die. Another destroyer was already turning its bow toward him, guns swiveling, preparing to unleash a second wall of fire. Every instinct in Larner's body told him to climb, to flee, to find safety in the clouds. But skip bombing at high altitude was no bombing at all. It was useless, harmless, a waste of bombs and lives. To win, he had to go low. Lower than common sense allowed. Lower than sanity permitted. So he pushed the Mitchell back down, the altimeter needle dropping until the waves outside his cockpit windows looked close enough to touch. The nose guns opened up again, the vibration jolting through the entire airframe as the B-25 spat fire at the destroyer's forward deck. He watched Japanese gunners dive for cover, tracer fire streaking past his canopy so close he could feel the heat. His top turret gunner shouted over the intercom, "We're drawing all their fire, they're blinded." That was the point. That was the entire gamble. If the B-25s could overwhelm the destroyer's guns with their own firepower, even for a few seconds, skip bombing became not suicidal, but possible. As another bomb-run aircraft raced toward a transport on Larner's right flank, the sea around it erupted into a dozen towering geysers. Fragments of metal howled across the water. One chunk tore through Larner's left wingtip, leaving a jagged scar of aluminum. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He had no bandwidth left for fear. Behind him, Lieutenant Sanderson's B-25 lined up on a target, engines screaming as he drove straight into the hellfire. Larner heard Sanderson's voice through the radio, strangely calm. On approach, taking heavy flak, bomb away. His bomb skipped beautifully, 3 small jumps across the surface, like a stone flicked by a giant hand, before disappearing under the hull and erupting in a violent column of water and flame. The transport cracked open like an egg. Sanderson whooped, the radio crackled with cheers. Then suddenly, I'm hit, port engine failing." His voice cut off in a burst of static. Larner twisted his head. Smoke was pouring from Sanderson's left engine, oil streaking across the fuselage, but the bomber was holding altitude, barely. "Climb, Sanderson, climb! Get above the guns!" Larner shouted. Sanderson's aircraft clawed upward, coughing black smoke, and vanished into a curtain of cloud. Larner couldn't help him. The convoy was in chaos now. Destroyers zigzagged, firing wildly. Some shifted to shield the transports, others broke formation entirely. What had begun as a tight defensive grid was quickly devolving into confusion, and confusion, in war, meant vulnerability. "New target," Larner shouted, banking hard left. The entire cabin shook from the G-forces. His co-pilot's knuckles turned white. Ahead of them, another transport loomed, its decks swarming with soldiers scrambling to man guns or jump into lifeboats. The ship was massive, an easy target, but also a trap. Big transports meant more guns, more angles, more ways to die. But it also meant more bodies if they made it to lay. Larner gritted his teeth. "We're taking it." He pushed the aircraft down again, the altimeter needle dropping to 40 feet. Waves slapped the underside of the fuselage. The Japanese guns roared, filling the air with glowing arcs. Larner's forward 50 cals answered with fury, ripping through gun nests and tearing down railings. He flew straight through the inferno, the world outside his cockpit nothing but flashes of orange, red, and violent white. 300 yards, the bombardier shouted. Larner held steady. 200, he could see individual soldiers now, their helmets glinting, their mouths open in shouts he could not hear. 150, steady, drop! The bomb hit the water and skipped once, twice, then sailed straight into the ship's hull with a dull, heavy whump before detonating from inside the steel belly. A shockwave rippled through the ship, lifting its bows slightly as fire belched from the interior. Larner pulled up hard, engines screaming, adrenaline burning through his veins. Behind him, 3 more Mitchells dove in. The sky became a whirl of smoke, tracers, and the deafening roar of engines as wave after wave of B-25s repeated the impossible. Bomb, skip, kill. The convoy was collapsing. One transport broke in 2 and sank within minutes. Another burned so fiercely that ammunition detonated for nearly an hour. A destroyer took a direct hit from strafing fire along its bridge, its command crew wiped out in an instant. Japanese radio transmissions became panicked bursts. "Our air attack, multiple hits, ship sinking, request immediate reinforcements, cannot contain, cannot..." The message cut off abruptly. In the space of 20 minutes, the untested, unauthorized tactic the brass had called reckless and impossible had ripped the beating heart out of the convoy. And as Larner's aircraft circled back for another strafing pass, he realized something almost surreal. Skip bombing was working. Not just working, rewriting the battle as it unfolded. The impossible was becoming reality, forged in heat, fire, and seawater turned to steam. But the battle was nowhere near finished. The Japanese destroyers had regrouped, their guns adjusting, their patterns tightening. The next attack run would be even deadlier. Larner steadied his breath. The real fight was only beginning. Smoke rolled across the surface of the Bismarck Sea like torn black curtains, drifting between burning ships as the Japanese destroyers finally regained their discipline. Their captains, shocked by the ferocity of the first attack, barked rapid orders through loudspeakers, realigning firing arcs and tightening defensive formations. The chaos was beginning to harden into structure again, and that meant the next assault would be the most dangerous one yet. Major Ed Larner felt the shift immediately. The wall of fire coming from the convoy had a new precision, a new rhythm. Each tracer arc calculated, each flak burst purposeful instead of wild. The destroyers were no longer reacting, they were hunting. He wiped sweat from his brow, though the air inside the cockpit was cold, tasting faintly of oil and metal. "This is where they try to kill us," he muttered. His co-pilot swallowed hard, but said nothing. Ahead of them, the convoy's remaining ships surged stubbornly through the waves, even as two transports burned bright enough to cast reflections across the water. The Japanese crews were terrified, but they were also relentless, firing every gun at anything that moved. One destroyer, its bows streaked with soot and fire damage, angled sharply toward Larner, presenting its broadside like a fortress. A split second later, the air detonated into a storm of tracers streaking toward the B-25. The world outside the cockpit erupted in violent ribbons of green and red light. Bullets passed so close they left shimmering vapor trails in the humid air. A fragment of metal smashed into the fuselage behind Larner's seat, spraying a burst of insulation across the cockpit. "That one almost got us," the co-pilot whispered. "Almost doesn't count," Larner growled. He dove again, forcing the Mitchell down to a height so low that the propellers kicked a fine mist off the waves. Instantly, the destroyer's heavy guns overshot, unable to depress far enough to track them. That created a narrow, deadly corridor of vulnerability, a space low enough to survive, but high enough to drop a skipping bomb if they timed it perfectly. "Nose guns, fire!" Larner shouted. The 4 forward 50 caliber Brownings thundered, the vibration so violent the cockpit panels rattled. He watched through the glass as rounds stitched across the destroyer's forward deck, cutting down gunners and smashing through steel shutters. A Japanese officer staggered backward, arms flailing, before disappearing into the sea. The suppressive fire worked, but only just. The destroyer's aft guns remained untouched and immediately opened up. Columns of water erupted behind the B-25, getting closer with every passing second. One shell exploded so near the tail that the entire aircraft jolted, the shockwave slamming through Larner's spine. "We can't hold this course much longer," the co-pilot shouted. "We only need 10 more seconds," Larner said through clenched teeth. 500 yards, 400, 300. "Bombay open!" A deep metallic groan vibrated through the airframe as the doors unlatched. The bombardier crouched low, gripping the release mechanism. 200 yards. Steady! Steady! A burst of flak exploded directly to their left, blinding white glare filling the cockpit. The concussion slammed the B-25 sideways, warning lights flickered, the left engine temp spiked. For a fraction of a second, the aircraft faltered, but Larner forced it leveled again, with raw instinct, fighting the controls, muscles burning. "Drop it now!" The bomb fell, hit the water, skipped once, and struck the destroyer amidships. The explosion tore a hole the size of a truck through the vessel's port side. Fire belched upward as men were thrown into the sea. The destroyer rolled violently, its stern dipping, then rising again, clinging desperately to survival. "Direct hit!" someone yelled over the radio. But there was no time to celebrate. More destroyers were cutting hard across the water, forming a defensive cage around the remaining transports. The sky had become a tangle of black smoke, burning fuel, and the constant strobe of gunfire. The air smelled of cordite and salt water vaporized by explosions. Larner caught sight of Lieutenant Collins' aircraft diving in from the right, guns blazing. His B-25's nose dipped dangerously low as he threaded through a curtain of tracers. "Collins, pull up! You're too low!" Larner shouted. Collins didn't answer. He was too focused, too locked in. His bomb released perfectly, skipping twice before smashing into a transport. The ship erupted upward in a massive plume of flame. Collins' aircraft cleared the blast by barely 20 feet. His waist gunner whooped into the radio, "She's going down! She's going all the way down!" But victory came with a cost. A burst of flak slammed into Collins' right engine. Flames spat from the capling as the aircraft limped upward, trailing black smoke. "I can keep her flying. Just get the rest of them." Larner watched him fade toward the cloud layer. There was nothing more he could do. The battle raged on. The sea was now dotted with burning hulks and lifeboats, the Japanese soldiers trapped by their own sinking convoy. Thick smoke blackened the horizon. The B-25 circled back again and again, strafing what was left of the ships. Each pass was a fight with death, each run a roll of the dice. By the 30-minute mark, 5 transports were burning or sinking. 2 destroyers were crippled. The remaining ships fought with savage desperation, their guns firing wildly in every direction. And then, just as Larner prepared for another attack run, he saw something that sucked the breath from his lungs. A destroyer was breaking formation, accelerating directly toward the path of the bombers, not to fight, but to ram. "They're trying to screen the transports with their own bodies," Larner whispered. The Japanese were preparing to die rather than surrender their soldiers. The battle had reached its most dangerous moment, and the fate of the entire convoy and perhaps the campaign in New Guinea would be decided in the next attack run.
The Japanese destroyer, charging ahead of the convoy, sliced through the waves with predatory intent, its bow rising and falling like the head of a beast ready to strike. It wasn't maneuvering to fire, nor was it turning to evade. It was accelerating in a straight line, a suicide screen, meant to physically block the B-25s from reaching the remaining transports. In that moment, Larner understood. The Japanese commanders were ready to die if it meant buying even a few more minutes for their troop-laden ships. As the destroyer surged forward, its guns erupted in a furious barrage. Tracers stitched upward in tight, disciplined lines, like glowing spears hurled into the sky. The air filled with streaks of red, orange, and white, a deadly latticework that any bomber entering would be shredded by. The pilots of the 90th Bomb Squadron had already flown through hell, but this was something entirely new. A wall of fire built not from chaos, but from perfect coordination and suicidal resolve. "Major, that destroyer's locking the entire run," Larner's co-pilot said, voice thinning with fear. "If we go straight in, we'll fly into a meat grinder." Larner knew he was right. He also knew there was no alternative. If the transports reached Leh, the Japanese would reinforce their forces with thousands of fresh troops, enough to crush Allied operations across New Guinea. Every B-25, every bomb, every man in the air mattered now. He keyed the radio. "All aircraft, listen up. We're going under their fire. No high approaches, no hesitation. We cut through at wave-top height and hit them before they adjust." Static answered him, followed by a single calm voice, Lieutenant Adams. "Copy that, Major. Lead us in." The formation shifted, tightening into a spearhead. 9 B-25s spread out in a shallow V, engines thundering, wings nearly touching. The destroyer's guns recalculated instantly and poured fire into the shape of the attack. One burst exploded ahead of Larner's nose, sending shockwaves through the cockpit and rocking the aircraft violently. Another burst erupted so close to the right wing that shrapnel peppered the fuselage like hail. "Hold steady," Larner barked, pushing the Mitchell lower until the altimeter needle dipped to 40 feet. Saltwater spray lashed against the windscreen. One wrong move, and they would clip the waves and cartwheel into the sea. But at this altitude, the destroyer's heavy guns overshot again, arcs of tracer fire passing harmlessly overhead. The Japanese weren't beaten, they were simply adjusting. Smaller, faster 25mm cannons opened up from the sides of the ship, flinging molten sparks across the surface of the water. The air in front of Larner's aircraft shimmered with heat and metal. But they were committed. Going in now was the only way out. "Nose guns, open fire!" The B-25s answered as one. The combined roar of 32 forward-facing 50-caliber machine guns filled the air, drowning out even the engines. Streams of fire hammered the destroyer's bow, ripping through the gun emplacements, smashing into rangefinders, shattering exposed ammunition crates. The destroyer's forward deck vanished into a cloud of splintering steel. Japanese gunners staggered, fell, or vanished entirely under the sheer volume of incoming rounds.
Larner saw pieces of metal and bodies fly upward as fire swept across the deck. But the destroyer kept coming, engines pounding, refusing to die. "They're still moving," the co-pilot shouted. Larner gritted his teeth. "Then we hit them harder." The B-25 formation swept across the destroyer's bow so low that one bomber's landing gear scraped the top of an AA gun and tore it clean off. In that split second, as the bombers crossed the lethal zone, the destroyer unleashed a final barrage from its midship guns. 2 tracers found their mark. One punched through the tail of Sergeant Miller's aircraft, severing control cables and sending the B-25 into a violent, spinning descent. His last transmission was a whisper, "Tell my wife." Then nothing but static. Another burst struck Lieutenant Brooks' right engine, which erupted in flame. Brooks shut it down, feathered the prop, and managed to hold the aircraft level, but he was out of the fight, limping away with a trail of smoke marking his path. For the rest of the formation, the window was now open. Larner instinctively banked right, lining up for a new run on one of the remaining transports. Off his left wing, Adams peeled away to hit the destroyer directly, shouting into the radio, "I'm taking the shot!" Larner didn't have time to argue. Adams came in low from the side, guns blazing. His strafing run was flawless, cutting through the last active gun positions and creating a momentary gap in the Japanese defensive fire. And in that fleeting moment, Lieutenant Harrigan, flying 2 aircraft behind, committed. Larner caught sight of Harrigan's B-25, diving like a hawk toward the destroyer. "Bombs away!" Harrigan's voice cracked through the radio. The bomb hit the water, skipped once, and slammed directly into the center of the ship. The explosion tore upward in a tower of white fire. The destroyer cracked open, broke its spine, and began sinking almost immediately. For the first time since the attack began, the Japanese formation faltered. Ships swerved erratically. Defensive fire slackened. The entire convoy was unraveling. Larner seized the moment. "All aircraft, regroup. Hit the remaining transports before they scatter." The B-25s pulled into loose formation. Engines straining, pilots fighting exhaustion in smoke-filled cabins. Flames reflected off the water like stained glass from some infernal cathedral. The sea was now a graveyard of twisted steel, oil slicks, and debris. The remnants of a convoy that had expected to land 7,000 soldiers at Leh by nightfall. Instead, it had been torn apart by a tactic command had dismissed as impossible. But the battle was not yet over. 2 transports remained, and one destroyer still fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. Larner wiped blood from a small cut on his brow, steadied his breath, and pushed his throttles forward. What happened next would decide the fate of the Bismarck Sea.
The sea below churned with fire, smoke, and sinking steel, but the last Japanese destroyer was still alive, barely. It staggered through the waves like a wounded predator, its hull scorched black, its bows split open from repeated strafing runs, yet its guns continued to spit fire with the desperation of men who knew they were the final shield between defeat and survival. 2 transports remained behind it, both still loaded with troops meant for Leh, both racing toward a coastline they would now never reach unless this destroyer bought them the impossible chance. Major Ed Larner knew exactly what that meant. As long as that destroyer was alive, skip-bombing the transports was nearly suicidal. Even one pass would turn the sky into a cage of fire. He watched its gun crews shifting positions across the deck, moving with robotic precision despite the carnage around them. Some were wounded, some barely standing, but still they manned their guns, still they aimed, still they fired. "That destroyer is holding the entire formation together," Larner said, voice low but steady. His co-pilot nodded grimly. "We take that one out, the rest collapse." "Exactly." Larner keyed the radio. "All aircraft, listen up. We killed the destroyer first. No one hits the transports until that thing is gone." A chorus of acknowledgments crackled through the radio, some steady, others tight with exhaustion. Only 7 B-25s were still combat capable. The rest were limping home or sinking beneath the waves. But 7 would have to be enough. The Japanese destroyer clearly sensed what was coming. It turned broadside toward the incoming bombers, shifting to maximize its firing arcs, transforming itself into a wall of flak and tracers so dense it looked like molten rain falling upward from the sea. "Holy hell," the co-pilot whispered. The entire sky ahead seemed to vibrate with explosions, as if the air itself was rebelling against their approach. Yet Larner pushed forward. He dropped the Mitchell to 40 feet again. The water rushed past in a blur, splashing against the belly of the aircraft in small bursts as the downdraft from the propellers whipped the surface into white streaks. The Japanese gunners opened up with ferocity. Tracer fire ripped across the waves, sparks exploding upwards like geysers. Flak bursts detonated all around the B-25, each one a brutal shock wave against the fuselage. A shell burst directly above them, showering the wings with shrapnel. Another burst ripped through the right engine cowling of the B-25 behind Larner, sending the bomber spiraling away, trailing flames. Larner didn't break, didn't waver, didn't give the destroyer so much as a heartbeat of hesitation. "Nose guns, fire!" The forward .50 calibers unleashed a torrent of destruction, ripping into the destroyer's bow, turning steel into flying shards. Larner could see Japanese gunners falling, blood mixing with seawater washing across the deck, ammunition crates exploding as .50 caliber rounds tore through them. But the destroyer kept firing. Its aft guns hammered the air, filling the approach path with explosions that rocked the Mitchell like a storm wave. Larner's co-pilot shouted, "We can't hold this line much longer." "We only need a few more seconds," Larner said, though his body shook from the battering pressure. Behind him, Lieutenant Adams dove in slightly higher, his top turret spraying bullets across the destroyer's superstructure. To the left, Harrigan positioned for a bomb run, lining up perfectly with the destroyer's midsection. "Harrigan, wait!" Larner barked. "Too early! Let us clear the way!" But Harrigan didn't wait. He fired, guns blazing, engines screaming, his B-25 racing forward like a spear. "For Miller," Harrigan growled, the pilot who had gone down minutes earlier. His bomb released. It skipped once, twice, and smashed into the destroyer's stern with brutal force. The explosion tore open the aft deck, sending flames and debris into the air. But the destroyer didn't die. It surged forward again, wounded but not broken, still firing with the stubborn resilience the Japanese Navy was infamous for. Larner clenched his jaw. "Fine," he said. "My turn." He banked sharply, engines howling in protest, and lined up for the cleanest, deadliest angle he could get. The destroyer's guns swiveled to meet him. Tracer fire streaked past his cockpit. One burst blew out a section of the left wing's trailing edge. The plane jolted hard, alarms blaring. The co-pilot's voice cracked. "Major, steady!" Larner yelled. "Bombay, open!" The doors groaned wide. The bombardier braced himself. Larner drove the B-25 in at 50 feet, then 40 feet, then so low the wake from the ship's bow splashed against the fuselage. Time slowed. The destroyer filled the cockpit window. Flames rippled across its deck. Gun crews shouted and fired and died all at once in a blur of motion. Drop! The bomb fell true. It hit the water, skipped in a perfect arc, and slammed into the destroyer directly under the bridge. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the world erupted. The explosion ripped upward through the superstructure, blowing the bridge apart, sending officers, guns, charts, and steel fragments flying into the air like burning confetti. The destroyer shuddered violently, its spine cracking, its bow rising as seawater poured into the shattered midsection. Within seconds, it was rolling. Within 30, it was sinking. Larned pulled up hard, the Mitchell barely responding, the controls heavy and trembling. "We got her," he whispered. "We finally got her." The radio crackled with voices, cheers, laughs, sobs, curses of relief. The last shield of the convoy had fallen, and now nothing stood between the B-25s and the two remaining transports. The final phase of destruction was about to begin.
The last Japanese destroyer slipped beneath the surface in a whirl of steam and churning black water, its bow rising one final time before disappearing forever into the depths of the Bismarck Sea. The smoke from its shattered bridge still hung in the air as a drifting black veil, marking the grave of men who had chosen to die protecting the transports behind them. And now those transports were alone. Two hulking shapes cutting through the waves, stripped of their escorts, stripped of their protection, stripped of any chance to reach Leh unless a miracle arrived. Major Ed Larner wasn't going to give them one. "All aircraft," he said, steadying his breath as he surveyed the sea of burning wreckage below, "form up for final attack runs. We finished this." The responses were tired, but resolute. Only 6 B-25s remained capable of fighting. Every aircraft bore scars, shredded panels, bullet holes across wings and fuselage, cracked glass, smoking dents, leaking fuel lines. But every man knew what was at stake. If even one transport made it to Leh carrying its cargo of thousands of Japanese soldiers, the brutal ground war in New Guinea would stretch into months of bloodshed. They had to sink both ships. And they had to do it now, before Japanese fighters could return, before the transports reached cloud cover, before the weather turned, before exhaustion claimed their reflexes. The transports steered erratically, zigzagging as fast as their engines would allow. One veered left, then sharply right, attempting to throw off the American attack pattern. The other attempted to turn its stern toward the approaching bombers, a tactic meant to reduce target size. Larner knew these evasive maneuvers all too well. They were the same movements he'd seen countless ships use in the Solomons and Coral Sea. But skip bombing didn't rely on prediction. It relied on proximity, timing, and sheer nerve. The B-25 formation descended again, engines thundering as they skimmed the surface of the ocean. The water raced beneath them in a blur of white spray and black waves reflecting the flames of the sinking convoy. Larner tightened his grip on the yoke. Sweat dripped down his temple as the horizon filled with the looming shapes of the two transports. Their decks swarmed with soldiers, hundreds of them, some manning small machine guns, others attempting to organize fire hoses, others staring upward in horror as the bombers approached like iron reapers. "First run is mine," Larner said. "Adams, you're on my wing. Harrigan, hit the second ship." "Copy. Roger. Let's end this." The B-25 surged toward the first transport. As they approached, the remaining Japanese gunners opened fire, though their jittery tracers lacked the discipline and accuracy of the destroyers. These men were infantry, cooks, clerks, not naval gunners. Their fire was wild, panicked, and easily suppressed. "Nose guns, fire!" Larner shouted. The forward .5 cals unleashed a devastating storm of bullets, tearing through the ship's railing, smashing lifeboats, chewing through the gun stations on deck. The sea around the transport blossomed with sparks where rounds hit water. Japanese soldiers dove for cover, some tumbling overboard as bullets pierced the air around them. Larner dropped lower, barely 50 feet above the surface. The windshield vibrated violently. The altitude was so low he could smell the salt and smoke mixing in the air. He steadied the Mitchell for the bomb run, ignoring the staccato impacts of small-caliber rounds pinging against the fuselage. 300 yards, the bombardier called. 200. Larner held his breath. 150. Drop! The bomb fell, struck the water, skipped once with the grace of a thrown stone, and slammed into the ship's hull. The explosion erupted deep inside the transport's cargo hold, sending a plume of fire and debris shooting skyward. Flames roared out from the ruptured side. Larner pulled up sharply, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as he raced over the burning deck. Behind him, Adams dove in, guns blazing. His bomb followed the same perfect path, punching into the softened hull and detonating with a deep, muffled roar. The first transport began listing almost immediately. Smoke poured from its midsection as soldiers screamed and scrambled across the deck. Some leapt into the water, others clung to debris, others fired futilely at the retreating bombers. "Ship 1 is done," Adams said, voice ragged with adrenaline. "It's going down." "Good," Larner replied. "Shift to ship 2. Harrigan was already there. His B-25 sliced across the waves at stomach-churning speed, nose guns blazing lines of fire into the hull of the second transport.
The Japanese soldiers aboard fired back desperately, tracers weaving upward like frantic orange vines. But Harrigan didn't flinch. He pushed his aircraft even lower, flying through the chaotic storm of bullets with the hard, reckless focus of a man fully committed. Larner watched from a distance as Harrigan's bomb released. It skipped beautifully 1, 2, 3 times before embedding itself beneath the transport's forward deck. The blast tore open the bow, sending steel plates twisting outward like the petals of a metal flower. Water rushed in with savage speed. The ship lurched, then groaned, a long, deep, horrible sound like the earth tearing open. "Second ship is mortally hit," Harrigan yelled. "She's going under." But the transport wasn't dying quietly. Secondary fires ignited across the deck as Japanese troops scrambled toward the stern in a futile attempt to escape. Some tried manning the guns again, spraying random fire across the ocean in one final gesture of defiance. Larner felt a pang of grim respect. These soldiers were trapped in a nightmare, burning decks, tilting floors, roaring explosions, yet they still fought. But the war had no mercy, no pause button, no sentiment. The ship's bow dipped deeper, water surged over the railings, the stern lifted, and then the entire transport began to roll onto its side, men sliding across the deck like pieces of driftwood. A cloud of steam erupted as water flooded the engine room. In less than 30 seconds, the massive ship disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only an oil slick and scattered survivors clinging to floating debris. Silence fell across the radio. Then someone whispered, "We did it." Someone else murmured, "My God." And finally, Adam's trembling voice broke through. "The convoy is gone. All of it. All gone." Larner closed his eyes. Not in relief, not yet. The sea was still burning. The air still echoed with distant screams. The battle wasn't over for the men below. But the mission, the impossible mission, was as good as won. Now came the most fragile part, survival. Getting home through skies that had already claimed too many. Larner steadied his shaking hands and turned the Mitchell toward Port Moresby. Behind him, the wreckage of the Japanese convoy smoldered beneath a gray sky, the tide carrying away the last remnants of one of Japan's greatest ambitions in New Guinea. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was ending, but its final chapter was still to be written. The burning graveyard of steel faded behind the B-25 formation as the surviving bombers clawed their way back toward Port Moresby, engines trembling from overuse, fuel tanks leaking from shrapnel wounds, and wings patched with more holes than anyone dared count. The sky ahead was an endless gray sheet stretching over the green expanse of New Guinea's wild interior, and beneath it, a silence settled inside the cockpits. Not the peaceful kind, but the exhausted, hollowed-out silence of men who had witnessed something monstrous, survived it, and were now beginning to understand what they had done. Major Ed Larner leaned back in his seat, loosening his death grip on the controls for the first time since the attack began. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath for minutes at a time during the final runs. Now he exhaled slowly, the release making him dizzy. He glanced back at the interior of his B-25, bullet holes along the fuselage, hydraulic fluid leaking from a line overhead, a section of the left wing's trailing edge shredded like torn paper. "How are we still flying?" his co-pilot murmured, staring at the instruments that flickered uncertainly under every vibration. "Because she knows we need her," Larner said, offering a tired half-smile, "and she's too stubborn to quit before we're home." Behind them, Adams' and Harrigan's bombers limped along at reduced power. One engine on Adams' aircraft was coughing every few seconds, a sound that chilled Larner even at this distance. A wounded engine in this terrain could kill a crew faster than gunfire, dropping them into mountains or jungles so thick rescue was nearly impossible. Larner radioed him. "Adams, how you holding up?" Static buzzed, then a strained voice replied, "We're alive. Right engine's hit, but she'll make it, I think." "You'll make it," Larner answered firmly. "Just stay on my wing." The jungle rolled beneath them like an endless green sea, its canopy broken only by cliffs, rivers, and the occasional clearing carved out for village gardens. This was some of the most unforgiving terrain in the world,
a place where downed crews were swallowed by heat, insects, and the impossible density of life fighting for space. The men all knew the stories. Pilots who survived a crash only to wander for weeks, delirious and starving, or vanish entirely without a trace. None of them wanted to join that list. As the coastline came into view, relief washed through the formation like a physical wave. The ocean glittered faintly, brighter than anything they'd seen in hours, a soft promise of home. Port Moresby lay just beyond it. Larner radioed ahead, voice cracking with exhaustion. "Base Control, this is Mitchell Lead. Returning from engagement. Multiple aircraft damaged. Request emergency priority for landing." The controller answered immediately, voice filled with something Larner hadn't expected: emotion. "Roger that. We've been tracking the battle. Bring him in, Major. Bring him home." The runway appeared like a dark ribbon carved into the pale terrain. Fire trucks and medical jeeps lined the strip. Mechanics and ground crew stood clustered near the edge, their faces tight with anticipation. They had heard every rumor by now: the massive convoy, the low-altitude charges, the ship kills. They were waiting to see who actually made it back. Larner brought his B-25 in low and slow, the damaged landing gear groaning as it extended. The wheels touched the ground, bounced once, and then settled into a rough but controlled roll. When the aircraft finally halted, Larner let his forehead rest against the control wheel. He hadn't realized how much his body hurt until the adrenaline began to fade. One by one, the surviving bombers landed. Some veered dangerously, tires blown, engines trailing smoke. Others came in almost sideways, pilots fighting shredded controls and asymmetrical power. But they made it. They all made it. Adams' aircraft nearly collapsed on its right gear, but held firm. Harrigan's left engine died completely the moment the wheels touched the runway. When he climbed out, he kissed the dirt. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft, helping wounded men out of turrets, carrying stretcher-bound crew to the medical trucks, inspecting damage with a mix of horror and awe. Major Larner stepped down from his B-25, legs barely holding him. A captain from the operations tent ran up to him. "Sir, is it true? Did you sink them?" Larner stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused. He didn't speak at first. Then he nodded. "All of them?" the captain whispered. Larner nodded again. Word spread across the airfield in seconds. Crewmen stopped what they were doing, turning to stare at the returning bombers. 30 minutes too late, the victory ripped through the base like electricity. Shouts erupted. Mechanics embraced. Gunners, half delirious from exhaustion, raised their fists. Someone began to cry. Someone else laughed. By noon, reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the impossible. The entire convoy had been destroyed. Not damaged, not scattered, not delayed. Destroyed. All 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. 4 more crippled beyond combat use. Over 3,000 Japanese troops killed. Hundreds more stranded in the open sea. The rest would never reach Leh. The battle was already being hailed in dispatches as the most decisive air-sea engagement since Midway. General George Kenney called Larner personally, his voice booming through the phone. "Major, you've rewritten the goddamn manual. Skip bombing is no longer an experiment. It's policy. Effective immediately." Larner didn't know what to say. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Only the faces of the men he'd lost. Only the jagged memory of burning ships and dying crews. That night, after the cheers faded and the paperwork began, Larner walked alone to the edge of the runway. The moon hung low over the mountains. The air was quiet. Too quiet. He looked out toward the dark sea, imagining the wreckage still drifting out there, the fires dying, the steam cooling, the bodies sinking. War never ended with victory. It ended with survivors trying to make sense of what they had lived through. And yet beneath that weight, he also felt something else. A hard, fierce pride, not for himself, but for the men who had followed him into the mouth of hell and returned. They had done what command said was impossible. They had taken a tactic scrawled on paper and proven it in fire. They had stopped the convoy. They had saved New Guinea from falling into darkness. And together, they had changed the course of the Pacific War. Larner looked at the sky. Dark, silent, endless. Tomorrow, more missions would come, more battles, more danger. But tonight, for the first time in months, the sky belonged to them.